Brian felt a slight flicker of recognition at the mention of the name, but his suspicions drowned it out quickly. "Dr. Lewis, huh?" he said, his voice laced with sarcasm. "And I'm supposed to believe that?" The girl nodded, her grip on the bag tightening. "Yes, sir. He's my dad." Brian stepped closer, towering over her. "Do you think I'm stupid? You're loitering in front of this store with a designer bag, and you expect me to believe it's a gift? Don't lie to me, kid." The girl's eyes brimmed with tears. "I'm not lying," she stammered. "I'm just waiting for my dad's driver to pick me up." "Your dad's driver?" Brian repeated, the skepticism in his tone impossible to miss. "And why would someone like you need a driver?" The girl took a shaky breath, her voice trembling. Because he's busy preparing for an event tonight. He's hosting a charity gala." Brian's jaw clenched. "A charity gala? Sure. Let's see some ID." "I don't have it on me," she admitted, her voice barely audible. Brian's patience wore thin. "Stand up," he ordered. The girl hesitated, her body trembling with fear. "I said stand up," Brian barked, his tone harsh and unforgiving. The girl slowly rose from the bench, clutching her bag tightly. A few passers-by paused to watch the escalating scene, their expressions ranging from curiosity to concern. Brian ignored them, focused solely on what he believed was a clear case of wrongdoing. "Empty your pockets," he demanded. The girl shook her head nervously. "I don't have anything," she whispered. Brian gestured toward the designer bag. "Open it. Dump everything out." Tears rolled down her cheeks as she unzipped the bag with trembling hands. She tipped it over, and its contents spilled onto the bench. A small wallet, a pack of gum, some loose change, and a lip gloss. Brian rifled through the items, his brow furrowing as he found nothing suspicious. Still, he wasn't ready to let it go. "Where's the receipt for the bag?" he asked, his voice sharp. The girl looked at him, confused. "It was a gift. I don't have a receipt." Brian shook his head. "Convenient," he muttered. He reached into the bag again and pulled out an envelope embossed with gold lettering. "What's this?" he asked, holding it up. The girl's face lit up with a glimmer of hope. "That's the invitation to my dad's gala," she explained. "It's tonight." Brian scoffed, shaking his head. "Yeah, right. And I'm the mayor. Let's see if this supposed invitation holds up." He opened the envelope and pulled out the thick cardstock. The lettering was elegant, the details clear. It was indeed an invitation to an exclusive charity gala, hosted by Dr. Lewis, one of the city's most prominent figures. Brian's heart skipped a beat as he read the name on the card, Miss Danielle Lewis. For a brief moment, doubt crept into his mind. Could she really be telling the truth? But his pride and ingrained assumptions quickly smothered the thought. "This doesn't prove anything," Brian muttered under his breath. He turned back to the girl, his expression hard. "If you're really who you say you are, you won't mind coming down to the station." The girl's eyes widened in fear. "What? No, I haven't done anything wrong." "Then you have nothing to worry about," Brian said coldly, grabbing her arm. "You're coming with me." The girl let out a small cry, her voice cracking with panic. "Please, I'm telling the truth." But Brian had already decided. As he guided her toward his patrol car, the murmurs of bystanders grew louder. Some reached for their phones, recording the scene unfolding before them. Others shouted in protest, their words lost to Brian's tunnel vision. He opened the back door and motioned for the girl to get in. "Let's go," he said firmly. She climbed into the car, tears streaming down her face. Through the rearview mirror, Brian could see her trembling, her small hands clutching the edge of the seat. "Please," she whispered one last time. "I'm not lying." Brian didn't respond. His mind was already racing with justifications for his actions, blind to the gravity of what he was about to set in motion. As Brian drove toward the station, he glanced in the rearview mirror. The girl, Danielle, if she was telling the truth, sat hunched over, tears silently streaming down her face. For a fleeting moment, a pang of doubt surfaced in Brian's mind, but he quickly buried it. "Stay focused," he muttered under his breath. "You're just doing your job." The streets blurred past the window as Danielle tried to process what was happening. Her heart pounded in her chest and her mind raced with confusion and fear. All she wanted was to get home, to feel safe again. But now she was locked in the back of a police car, treated like a criminal for reasons she couldn't understand. When they arrived at the station, Brian parked and opened the back door. "Come on," he said, his tone brusque but not unkind. Danielle hesitated, her small frame shaking as she stepped out of the car. Inside, the fluorescent lights of the station were harsh, making everything feel colder and more sterile. Officers bustled about, but a few paused to glance at Brian and the young girl he escorted. The whispers began almost immediately. "Who's the kid? Did Cooper bring in a minor? She doesn't look like trouble. What's going on?" Brian ignored them all, guiding Danielle to a small, windowless interrogation room. The stark walls and single metal table in the center amplified her feelings of isolation. "Sit," he ordered, gesturing to the chair. Danielle obeyed, lowering herself into the seat. She clutched her bag tightly, even though its contents had been taken away during the drive. Her eyes were red and swollen, but she refused to cry again. "I have to stay strong," she told herself. "Dad will come for me." Brian sat across from her, his expression unreadable as he pulled out a clipboard. "Name?" he asked, his pen poised to write. Danielle's voice was barely above a whisper. "Danielle Lewis." Brian paused, the name tugging at his memory again. Something about it seemed familiar, but he still couldn't place it. "Age?" 10, she replied, her voice trembling. Brian frowned. She looked younger to him, though he couldn't explain why that fact irritated him. "And where were you when I found you?" Danielle hesitated, her small hands gripping the edge of the chair. "I told you." "I was waiting for my dad's driver outside the boutique." Brian's eyes narrowed. "Right, your dad, Doctor Lewis," he said, his tone dripping with skepticism. "And you're sticking to that story?" "It's not a story," Danielle cried, her voice cracking. "It's the truth." Brian sighed heavily, leaning back in his chair. "All right," he said, rubbing his temple. "If that's the truth, then you won't mind me running your name through our system. Let's see what it says." Danielle watched as he walked out of the room, leaving her alone with her thoughts. Her father's voice echoed in her mind. "If you're ever in trouble, stay calm and tell the truth. We'll always be there for you." She clung to that reassurance now, though it felt like a lifeline slipping from her grasp. Meanwhile, in the station's operations room, Brian sat at a computer, typing her name into the database. As the results loaded, his confidence began to waver. When her profile appeared on the screen, his stomach dropped. Danielle Lewis, age 10, daughter of Dr. Michael Lewis. Not just a prominent local figure, he was a nationally recognized leader in public health and a current candidate for state senate. Brian's face turned pale. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, trembling as the weight of his mistake sank in. "No," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "This can't be right." He scrolled through her profile, hoping against hope that he'd misread something. But the evidence was irrefutable. The girl sitting in the interrogation room wasn't just someone's daughter. She was someone important, someone powerful, and he had treated her like a criminal. "Cooper," a voice interrupted, pulling him from his spiraling thoughts. It was Officer Martinez, a colleague who had noticed his distressed expression. "What's going on?" Brian swallowed hard. I made a mistake," he admitted, his voice shaking. "The girl I brought in, she's Dr. Lewis's daughter." Martinez's eyes widened. "Wait, the Dr. Lewis? The one running for Senate?" Brian nodded numbly, his hands gripping the edge of the desk. "Yeah, that Dr. Lewis." Martinez didn't hesitate. "You need to tell the chief. Now." Brian hesitated, dread pooling in his stomach. He knew Martinez was right, but the thought of facing the chief and the inevitable fallout felt insurmountable. I need a minute," he muttered, rising from his chair. Martinez grabbed his arm, her grip firm. "You don't have a minute, Cooper. You're in deep trouble, and the only way out is to own up to it." Brian looked at her, his expression one of desperation. "I didn't mean for this to happen," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "That doesn't matter," Martinez replied bluntly. "What matters is fixing it. Go." Brian nodded reluctantly, making his way toward the chief's office. Every step felt like a march toward his own execution. His colleagues watched him in silence, their faces a mix of curiosity and concern. When he reached the door, he took a deep breath and knocked. "Come in," came the gruff voice of Chief Daniels. Brian stepped inside, his shoulders slumped. Chief Daniels, a no-nonsense woman with years of experience under her belt, looked up from her paperwork with a raised eyebrow. "What is it, Cooper?" Brian swallowed hard, his voice shaking as he began to speak. "Chief, I think I've made a serious mistake." Chief Daniels leaned back in her chair, her sharp eyes narrowing. "What kind of mistake?" she asked, her voice calm but laced with authority. Brian hesitated, his hands gripping the edge of the desk in front of him. "The girl I brought in, Danielle Lewis, I thought she was up to something suspicious. But when I ran her name through the system..." His voice faltered. Daniels raised an eyebrow. "And?" Brian took a deep breath. "She's Dr. Michael Lewis's daughter." The weight of his words settled heavily in the room. Chief Daniels's expression darkened, and she slowly leaned forward, placing her hands flat on the desk. "Are you telling me," she said, her voice low and deliberate, "that you detained the daughter of a man who is not only a prominent public figure, but also running for state senate? Without cause?" Brian nodded, his face pale. "Yes, Chief." Daniels closed her eyes briefly, taking a deep breath as if to steady herself. When she opened them again, her gaze was icy. "Do you have any idea what kind of firestorm you've just unleashed? The phone is probably already ringing off the hook with calls from his legal team and the press." "I know," Brian admitted, his voice barely audible. "I messed up. I let my assumptions cloud my judgment." "That's putting it mildly," Daniels snapped. She stood and reached for the phone on her desk. "We need to inform Dr. Lewis immediately and start damage control." Brian's stomach churned as he watched her dial the number. Each ring seemed to echo louder in his ears, his dread growing with every second. Finally, the line connected. "Dr. Lewis," Daniels began, her voice professional but strained. "This is Chief Daniels from the precinct. I'm calling to inform you that your daughter Danielle is currently at the station." There was a pause, and then Brian could hear Dr. Lewis's voice erupting through the receiver, even though he couldn't make out the exact words. The anger was unmistakable. Daniels winced slightly but maintained her composure. "Yes, sir, I understand. I assure you, this was a misunderstanding and we're handling it." "Of course, sir. Please come down to the station and we can discuss this further." "Yes, immediately." She hung up the phone and turned to Brian, her expression grim. "He's on his way. I hope you're ready to explain yourself because this isn't going to be pretty." Brian nodded, his throat dry. "Understood." As Daniels dismissed him, Brian walked back into the station's main room, his steps heavy. The tension in the air was palpable, with officers exchanging hushed whispers and glances. Brian could feel their eyes on him, their judgment weighing him down. He returned to the interrogation room, where Danielle sat silently, her small frame hunched over the table. Her tear-streaked face looked up at him as he entered, her expression a mixture of fear and defiance. "Your dad is on his way," Brian said, his voice softer than before. Danielle didn't respond. She simply looked down at her hands, which were clenched tightly in her lap. The silence stretched between them, thick and oppressive. Before Brian could say anything else, the sound of the station doors slamming open reverberated through the building. Murmurs filled the air as the unmistakable figure of Dr. Michael Lewis strode in, his presence commanding attention. Behind him, his wife followed, her expression one of barely restrained fury. "Where is my daughter? Dr. Lewis demanded, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. Chief Daniels quickly intercepted him, motioning toward the interrogation room. "Right this way, Doctor." "Lewis." Brian stood frozen as the door opened, revealing Danielle. The moment she saw her father, she bolted from her chair and ran to him. "Daddy!" she cried, throwing her arms around his waist. Dr. Lewis knelt down, holding her tightly. "I'm here, sweetheart, I'm here." Mrs. Lewis joined them, tears streaming down her face as she cupped Danielle's cheek. "Are you okay, baby?" she asked, her voice trembling. Danielle nodded, though her eyes were red and swollen. "I'm okay, Mom," she said softly. "Just scared." Dr. Lewis straightened, his gaze hardening as he turned to face Brian. "You," he said, his tone cold and accusatory. "Explain yourself. Now." Brian felt his stomach drop. "Sir, I don't want excuses," Dr. Lewis interrupted sharply. "I want to know why you felt it was appropriate to detain my 10-year-old daughter, interrogate her, and treat her like a criminal." Brian swallowed hard. "I thought she was suspicious, sir. I made an assumption based on—" "Based on what?" Dr. Lewis snapped, his voice rising. "Her skin color? Her presence in a wealthy neighborhood? Do you even hear yourself right now?" Brian's face flushed with shame. "I was wrong," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I let my biases cloud my judgment." "That's not good enough," Mrs. Lewis interjected, her voice shaking with anger. "Do you have any idea what you've put her through? The fear, the humiliation?" "I'm sorry," Brian said, his words sounding hollow even to himself. "I truly am." Dr. Lewis's eyes burned with fury, but beneath it was a deep hurt. "Your apology won't undo what you've done. My daughter will remember this for the rest of her life. This isn't just about you or her. It's about a system that allows this kind of behavior to happen over and over again." Brian's head hung low as the weight of his actions pressed down on him. "You're right," he said quietly. "I failed her. I failed this community. And I failed myself." Dr. Lewis's jaw clenched as he stared at Brian, the room falling silent under the weight of his gaze. The anger in his expression was undeniable, but so was the disappointment, a deeper wound that seemed harder to bear. He pulled Danielle closer, his protective grip around her unwavering. Chief Daniels stepped forward, her voice firm but measured. "Dr. Lewis, I assure you, we are treating this matter with the utmost seriousness. Officer Cooper's actions will be thoroughly reviewed, and disciplinary measures will be taken." "Disciplinary measures?" Mrs. Lewis's voice cracked with incredulity. "This isn't about a slap on the wrist. It's about accountability. This isn't just an isolated incident. It's a symptom of a much bigger problem." Dr. Lewis raised a hand, quieting his wife gently, though his stern gaze remained fixed on Chief Daniels. "What happened here today is not only an individual failure but a systemic one. I want to know what steps this department is going to take to ensure that no other family has to endure what we just went through." Chief Daniels nodded, her lips pressing into a thin line. "You're absolutely right, Dr. Lewis. This incident is unacceptable, and it highlights the need for change within our department. We'll be implementing mandatory training on racial sensitivity and implicit bias for all officers." "That's not enough," Dr. Lewis said firmly. "Training is only part of the solution. There needs to be accountability, transparency, and a commitment to rebuilding trust with this community, and it starts with officers like him." He pointed at Brian, his voice sharp. "I want to hear from him directly, what he plans to do to make this right." Brian looked up slowly, the weight of their expectations pressing down on him. "I know I can't undo what I've done," he began, his voice heavy with regret. "But I can promise to learn from this, to confront the biases that led me to act the way I did today. I want to be part of the change this department needs." Dr. Lewis's expression softened slightly, though the steel in his voice remained. "Words are cheap, Officer Cooper. I'll be watching to see if your actions match them." Brian nodded. "I understand, sir, and I'll do whatever it takes." Danielle, who had been quietly clinging to her father's side, finally spoke up. Her voice was soft but steady. "I forgive you, Officer Cooper." Everyone in the room turned to look at her, surprised by her words. Brian's breath caught in his throat as he met her gaze. You forgive me?" he asked, his voice trembling. Danielle nodded. "What you did was wrong, and it hurt me. But I think you know that. And I think you can do better." Dr. Lewis looked down at his daughter, pride and sadness mingling in his expression. "You're stronger than I ever could have imagined," he said quietly. Mrs. Lewis knelt down, wrapping her arms around Danielle. "You amaze me every day," she whispered. The moment was interrupted by a knock at the door. Another officer stepped in, holding a phone. "Dr. Lewis, the press has caught wind of this situation. Reporters are already outside." Dr. Lewis sighed, his exhaustion evident. "Of course they are." Chief Daniels looked at him, her tone apologetic. "I understand if you want to make a public statement. I'll support whatever decision you make." Dr. Lewis glanced at Danielle, then at Brian. "I'll make a statement," he said, "but it won't be just about today. It will be about what needs to change, about how this department, this city, and this country can do better." Brian felt his chest tighten, knowing that his actions had ignited a firestorm that went far beyond the walls of the station. He wasn't just facing the consequences of his own mistakes. He had become a symbol of a much larger issue. In the hours that followed, the precinct buzzed with activity as the media gathered outside. Dr. Lewis gave a measured and impactful statement, calling for systemic reforms while emphasizing the need for accountability and education. His words resonated far beyond the city, sparking conversations about policing and bias on a national scale. Inside the station, Brian sat in the chief's office awaiting his fate. Chief Daniels entered, her expression a mixture of disappointment and resolve. "Cooper," she began, her voice steady, "what you did today was inexcusable, but I believe you're capable of change. Here's what's going to happen." Brian straightened in his seat, bracing himself. "You're suspended for 3 months without pay," she continued. "During that time, you'll be required to complete extensive sensitivity and anti-bias training. Once that's done, I expect you to lead training sessions for the rest of the department, sharing your experience and what you've learned." Brian nodded, his throat tight. "I understand, Chief. Thank you for giving me the chance to make amends." "This isn't just about making amends, Cooper," she said, her tone firm. "It's about doing the work to become the officer you should have been all along." Weeks later, Brian found himself sitting in a classroom surrounded by other officers. The instructor, a woman with decades of experience in community relations, spoke passionately about the impact of bias in policing. As Brian listened, he began to see his actions in a new light, not as isolated mistakes, but as part of a broader problem he had ignored for too long. He thought of Danielle's tearful face, her small voice saying, "I forgive you." That forgiveness felt like both a gift and a challenge, a reminder that he owed her, her family, and his community something more. By the end of his suspension, Brian had completed the training and volunteered to help implement department-wide reforms. He stood before his colleagues, sharing his story with raw honesty and urging them to confront their own biases. Months later, Dr. Lewis and Danielle attended a community meeting at the precinct. Brian stood at the front of the room, addressing a group of officers and local residents. "When I made the decision to detain Danielle, I thought I was doing my job," he said, his voice steady but emotional. "But I wasn't protecting anyone. I was acting on fear and prejudice, and I failed her. I failed all of you." He turned to Danielle, who was seated in the front row with her father. "Your courage and forgiveness changed my life," he said, "and I promise to honor that by being better, by doing better." Danielle smiled, her expression filled with quiet strength. Dr. Lewis nodded, a glimmer of approval in his eyes. Brian's journey wasn't easy, and it wasn't over. But step by step, he began to rebuild trust. With himself, with his colleagues, and with the community he had sworn to serve. And through it all, he carried the memory of a young girl who had taught him the true meaning of justice and grace. As months turned into a year, the changes in the precinct became evident. The mandatory bias training initiated by Dr. Lewis's demands was not just a one-time measure, it became an integral part of the department's culture. Officers were required to engage in community outreach programs, fostering relationships with neighborhoods they once viewed with suspicion. Brian Cooper took these reforms to heart. He volunteered for every opportunity to connect with the people he once served from a distance. Community meetings, youth programs, and local initiatives became his new norm. Slowly, the hardened edges of his worldview began to soften, replaced by a deeper understanding of the people behind the faces he had once categorized out of habit. One afternoon, Brian found himself standing in front of a classroom filled with middle school students. The principal of a nearby school had invited him to speak about his experiences. Danielle sat in the front row, her presence a silent yet powerful reminder of why he was there. Brian took a deep breath as he addressed the students. "When I became a police officer, I thought the badge gave me all the answers," he began, his voice steady but reflective. "I thought it was my job to make snap judgments, to act quickly without question. But I learned, too late, that those judgments can hurt people. They can break trust. They can even destroy lives." The students listened intently as Brian shared his story. Not as a hero, but as someone who had made mistakes and was working to make them right. Danielle raised her hand, and when Brian called on her, she asked, "What's the hardest part about changing?" Brian paused, considering her question. "The hardest part," he said slowly, "is admitting that you were wrong. It's looking at yourself in the mirror and realizing you're not the person you thought you were. But once you do that, once you decide to change, you realize that it's never too late to start doing better." Danielle smiled, her quiet courage still inspiring him as much as it had that fateful day. In the community, Brian's efforts did not go unnoticed. Parents began to recognize him not as the intimidating officer who patrolled their streets, but as someone who genuinely cared about their well-being. Children who had once feared his presence in uniform now ran up to him with excited waves and questions. Slowly but surely, trust began to rebuild. Dr. Lewis remained an active figure in these efforts, often appearing alongside Brian at public forums. Though their initial interactions had been fraught with tension and anger, they now shared a mutual respect. Dr. Lewis saw in Brian a man who was not just paying lip service to change, but was living it in his actions. At one such forum, Brian spoke directly to the community. "I'm not here to erase the mistakes I made," he said, his voice filled with humility. "I'm here to learn from them, to listen, and to do everything in my power to ensure that this department serves you, not the other way around." Dr. Lewis nodded in approval, adding, "Accountability is the foundation of trust, and trust is what holds communities together. Officer Cooper is one example of how we can take steps toward repairing the damage that's been done, but this is just the beginning." Despite the progress, not everyone was quick to forgive. Brian faced criticism from activists and community members who felt his actions were unforgivable. Some saw his transformation as performative, a convenient way to escape harsher consequences. Brian didn't shy away from these confrontations. Instead, he listened. At one particularly heated town hall, a young man stood up and said, "You think showing up to a couple of meetings makes up for what you did? You humiliated a child. You traumatized her. What if she wasn't Dr. Lewis's daughter? Would you have even cared about what you did?" The room fell silent as everyone turned to Brian, waiting for his response. He took a moment to gather his thoughts before speaking. "You're right," he said, his voice calm but firm. "What I did to Danielle was unacceptable, and it's not something that can be undone. And you're right to ask that question, because the truth is, I don't know. If she hadn't been the daughter of someone powerful, maybe I wouldn't have faced the consequences I did. And that's a problem. It's a problem with the system, and it's a problem with me." He looked directly at the young man. "I can't change the past, but I can promise you this. I'll keep showing up. I'll keep listening. I'll keep working to make sure that no one else has to go through what Danielle went through. You don't have to forgive me, and I won't blame you if you don't, but I'm not going to stop." The young man stared at Brian for a long moment before nodding and sitting down. The room buzzed with murmurs, but the tension began to ease. Over time, Brian's commitment to change inspired others within the department to examine their own biases. Officers who had initially dismissed the training sessions as unnecessary began to engage more openly, sharing their own struggles and stories. What started as a single incident became the catalyst for a broader cultural shift within the precinct. Danielle continued to play a role in these efforts, often attending events and speaking about her experiences. Her courage and wisdom left an indelible mark on everyone who heard her. Even as she grew older, she remained a beacon of hope for the community. One day, years later, Brian received a handwritten letter in the mail. It was from Danielle, now a teenager. "Dear Officer Cooper," it read, "I wanted to thank you for keeping your promise. You've shown me that people can change, and that gives me hope for the future. I'll never forget what happened, but I'll also never forget how hard you worked to make things right. Thank you for listening, for learning, and for standing up for what's right." Sincerely, Danielle Bryan held the letter in his hands, tears welling in his eyes. It was a reminder that while redemption wasn't easy, it was always worth striving for. Years after that fateful day, the city stood as a testament to the profound changes sparked by a single moment of reckoning. The precinct, once a source of tension, had become a hub for community engagement and reform. Officers who had once patrolled neighborhoods with suspicion now walked those same streets with purpose, greeting residents by name and attending local events as allies rather than enforcers. Brian Cooper, once known for his rigidity and biases, became one of the most outspoken advocates for accountability and justice within the force. His transformation was not a linear journey. There were setbacks, moments of doubt, and times when he questioned whether he was truly making a difference. But he persisted, driven by a promise he had made not only to Danielle, but to himself. One crisp autumn morning, Brian was invited to speak at a statewide conference on policing and community relations. The event was hosted by none other than Dr. Michael Lewis, now a state senator, whose platform centered on justice reform and bridging divides. The room was packed with officers, community leaders, and activists from across the state. As Brian stepped up to the podium, he felt a familiar knot of anxiety in his stomach. He glanced at the front row, where Dr. Lewis sat beside Danielle, now a poised teenager. Her calm, steady gaze gave him the courage to begin. "Good morning," Brian started, his voice carrying through the room. "When I first became a police officer, I thought I understood what it meant to serve. I thought I was protecting my community. But the truth is, I was protecting an idea of the community that existed only in my mind, one shaped by fear and ignorance." He paused, scanning the faces in the audience. "Years ago, I made a terrible mistake. I let my assumptions and prejudices guide my actions, and in doing so, I hurt a young girl who deserved nothing but kindness and respect. That mistake forced me to confront a truth I had ignored for far too long, that wearing a badge doesn't absolve you of your biases. It makes it even more important to address them." Brian's voice grew stronger as he continued. "Change isn't easy. It's uncomfortable. It requires humility, accountability, and the willingness to admit when you're wrong. But it's also necessary, not just for us as individuals, but for the communities we serve." He turned toward Danielle, a small smile on his face. "Danielle taught me that forgiveness is a powerful gift, but it's not something you're entitled to. It's something you earn. Every day I strive to earn the trust I broke that day, and I'm standing here today because of her courage, her grace, and her belief that people can change." The room erupted in applause, and Brian stepped back from the podium, feeling a sense of fulfillment he hadn't experienced in years. Dr. Lewis stood and shook his hand firmly. "Well said, Cooper," he remarked. "You've come a long way." Danielle approached him next, her expression thoughtful. "You did good," she said softly. "But don't stop now. There's still a lot of work to do." Brian nodded, her words resonating deeply. "I won't stop. I promise. As the years passed, the ripples of that single encounter continued to spread. Danielle grew into a fierce advocate for justice, inspired by her father's leadership and her own experiences. She often spoke at schools, colleges, and forums, sharing her story as a way to inspire others to confront prejudice and work toward understanding. Brian, now nearing retirement, dedicated his remaining years on the force to mentoring younger officers. He worked tirelessly to ensure that the lessons he had learned would be passed down to a new generation of law enforcement, one committed to empathy, fairness, and service. On his last day as an officer, the precinct held a small ceremony in his honor. Colleagues, community members, and even Danielle and her family gathered to celebrate his years of service and the impact he had made. As Brian accepted a plaque commemorating his career, he felt a deep sense of gratitude, not for the recognition, but for the opportunity to have made amends and to have grown into a better man. Later that evening, as Brian packed up his office, he came across the letter Danielle had written him years earlier. He read it again, the words bringing a lump to his throat. He carefully folded it and placed it in his pocket, knowing it was a reminder he would carry with him always. Stepping out into the cool night air, Brian looked up at the city skyline, its lights twinkling against the darkened sky. The road to redemption had been long and arduous, but it had also been worth every step. "Thank you, Danielle," he whispered, his voice carried away by the wind, "for showing me the way." As he walked away from the station for the last time, he felt not an ending but a beginning, one filled with hope, understanding, and the promise of a brighter future. Paul's heart raced as he stood on the edge of the community picnic, looking out at the sea of faces spread across the park. Families were laughing together, officers mingled with residents, and a band played softly in the background. The progress the community had made was evident, but Paul couldn't help feeling like he was still on the outside looking in. Then he spotted Kayla and her family again, their laughter cutting through his unease like a ray of light. He took a deep breath and stepped forward, weaving his way through the crowd. As he approached, Kayla noticed him first, her face breaking into a bright smile. "Officer Reynolds!" she called, waving him over. "Come join us." Her voice carried a warmth that eased the knot in Paul's chest. Mayor Johnson stood and extended his hand as Paul reached them. "Paul," the mayor said with a firm but friendly handshake, "we're glad you could make it." Paul felt his nerves settle under the mayor's steady gaze. "Thank you for inviting me, Mayor Johnson," Paul replied. "It means a lot to be here." Kayla's mother motioned to an empty seat on the blanket they had laid out. "Please sit down," she offered with a smile. "We have plenty of food." Paul hesitated for only a moment before sitting. The conversation around him was light and easy, touching on everything from the weather to the upcoming community basketball tournament. Paul found himself relaxing, the barriers he had once built around himself crumbling brick by brick. As they ate, Kayla turned to him with a thoughtful expression. "Officer Reynolds," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "Do you ever think about what it means to truly belong to a community?" Paul paused, considering her question carefully. "I think I'm only starting to understand," he admitted. "For a long time, I thought belonging was about being in control, about enforcing rules. But now I see it's about trust, building it and earning it." Kayla nodded, her smile soft. "That's a good answer," she said, "and a good start." The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of laughter, conversation, and shared meals. Paul saw officers and residents interacting in ways that would have been unthinkable just months ago, smiling, joking, and working together toward a common goal. He realized this wasn't just progress. It was transformation. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the crowd began to thin, Paul found himself sitting on a bench near the edge of the park. The soft hum of crickets filled the air, and the distant chatter of the remaining attendees was a comforting backdrop. Kayla approached him, carrying 2 paper cups of lemonade. She handed one to Paul and sat down beside him. "Long day?" she said, taking a sip. Paul chuckled softly. It has been, but a good one. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the last rays of sunlight fade into the night. "Do you ever think about that first day we met?" Kayla asked, her tone gentle but probing. Paul winced slightly but nodded. "I think about it all the time," he admitted. "I think about how blind I was, how much harm I caused without even realizing it. It's something I'll carry with me forever." Kayla tilted her head, studying him. "But you've changed," she said. "That's what matters." Paul looked at her, gratitude shining in his eyes. "Thank you for saying that," he said quietly. "And thank you for giving me the chance to change. You didn't have to." Kayla shrugged, her expression thoughtful. "Maybe not," she said. "But what good would holding on to anger have done? You showed me that people can grow. And if I hadn't believed in that, we wouldn't be here today." Her words settled heavily in Paul's heart, filling him with both humility and resolve. "You're wise beyond your years," he said with a soft smile. Kayla grinned. "I get that a lot." As the months turned into years, the changes sparked by Kayla's courage and Paul's transformation continued to ripple through the community. The Bridging the Gap program expanded to other precincts, becoming a model for police reform nationwide. Community members and officers alike found common ground, building a foundation of trust and mutual respect. Paul remained deeply involved in the program, mentoring new recruits and sharing his story openly. He became a voice for change, not just within the department, but in the broader movement for justice and equality. Kayla grew into a leader in her own right. By the time she reached high school, she was already organizing town halls and youth leadership programs, inspiring her peers to work for a brighter future. Her bond with Paul remained strong, a testament to the power of forgiveness and the possibility of redemption. One evening, years after the picnic, Paul found himself back at the community center for a special event. The room was packed with familiar faces, all gathered to celebrate the 5th anniversary of the program's founding. As the evening's keynote speaker, Paul stepped up to the podium, his heart full. "5 years ago," he began, "I was a very different person. I let fear and prejudice guide my actions, and I hurt people I should have been protecting." He paused, scanning the room. His eyes found Kayla, sitting with her parents in the front row, her face glowing with pride. "But because of this community," Paul continued, "because of people like Kayla and her family, I was given a second chance. I was given the opportunity to learn, to grow, and to make amends. And for that, I am endlessly grateful." The room erupted into applause, but Paul wasn't done. "The work doesn't stop here," he said. "If we want to create a future where trust and justice are the norm, we have to keep showing up. For each other, for our neighbors, for our communities." As he stepped down from the podium, Paul felt a sense of peace he hadn't known before. The road had been long and difficult, but it had brought him here, to a place of understanding, purpose, and hope. After the celebration at the community center, Paul sat in his car for a long moment, reflecting on how much his life had changed. The road to that point had been anything but smooth, yet the growth he had experienced made every challenge worthwhile. He thought about Kayla's unwavering faith in him and the countless stories he had heard from community members that continued to shape his understanding of justice. The city itself had become a beacon of hope for other communities struggling with similar divides. The Bridging the Gap program, now in its 5th year, was being adopted in neighboring towns and even other states. Officers from Paul's precinct traveled to lead workshops and share their experiences, while residents spoke at conferences about how the program had transformed their relationship with law enforcement. Paul became a sought-after speaker, though he was careful never to let the recognition distract from the message. In every speech, he emphasized the importance of humility and the power of listening. "It's not about me," he would say. "It's about the people who trusted me enough to hold me accountable and help me grow. Change doesn't happen alone. It happens together." One day, Paul received an invitation in the mail that left him both honored and nervous. Kayla, now a senior in high school, was giving a speech at a statewide youth leadership summit. She had asked Paul to attend as her guest. The event was a culmination of years of her advocacy work, and it was clear she was stepping fully into her role as a leader. When the day arrived, Paul sat in the audience among hundreds of attendees, his heart swelling with pride as Kayla took the stage. She stood confidently at the podium, her voice strong and clear. "Good morning," she began, her gaze sweeping the crowd. "I'm here today to talk about something deeply personal, about how we, as young leaders, have the power to shape the future." Kayla paused, letting the room settle. "When I was 10 years old, I had an encounter with a police officer that changed my life. It was one of the scariest moments I've ever experienced. I felt powerless, judged, and afraid for reasons I didn't understand." Paul's stomach tightened as she spoke. The memory of that day still haunted him, but he reminded himself that this moment was about her strength, not his guilt. "But," Kayla continued, her voice steady, "what happened next is what truly defined the story. That officer, Paul Reynolds, made a choice to change. He chose to confront his biases, to listen, and to learn. And through programs like Bridging the Gap, he became an advocate for justice and understanding." The audience murmured in approval, but Kayla held up a hand to quiet them. "This isn't just about him," she said. "It's about all of us. It's about recognizing our own prejudices, no matter how small, and challenging ourselves to do better. It's about creating systems that support accountability and foster empathy." Kayla's eyes scanned the crowd, landing briefly on Paul. "If someone like Officer Reynolds can change, then so can we. And when we change ourselves, we change the world." The room erupted into applause, and Paul felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes. He had never imagined that the young girl he once wronged could become such an inspiration, not just to him, but to everyone who heard her story. After the event, Kayla found Paul in the crowd. She smiled brightly as she approached him, her confidence radiant. "Thank you for coming," she said. Paul smiled back, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for inviting me. You were incredible up there." Kayla shrugged, her smile turning playful. "I learned from the best." Paul chuckled, shaking his head. "I think you've surpassed your teacher." As they stood together, Paul felt a sense of closure he hadn't realized he needed. The journey that had begun with a terrible mistake had brought them both to a place of understanding and hope. "I'm proud of you, Kayla," Paul said, his voice steady, "and I'll keep doing my part to make sure your message reaches as many people as possible." Kayla nodded. "I know you will, and I'm proud of you too, Officer Reynolds." In the years that followed, Paul retired from the police force but remained deeply involved in the Bridging the Gap program. He dedicated his time to mentoring officers and speaking about his journey at schools, conferences, and training academies. Kayla went on to study social justice and public policy in college, using her platform to advocate for systemic change. Her relationship with Paul remained strong, a symbol of what was possible when people chose compassion and accountability over division. Their story became a reminder that even the deepest divides could be bridged, one step at a time. And in their city, where the streets once seemed filled with mistrust, a new legacy was being written, one of hope, understanding, and a commitment to seeing the humanity in everyone. Years passed, and the city continued to evolve. The road to that point had been anything but smooth, yet the growth he had experienced made every challenge worthwhile. He thought about Kayla's unwavering faith in him and the countless stories he had heard from community members that continued to shape his understanding of justice. The city itself had become a beacon of hope for other communities struggling with similar divides. The Bridging the Gap program, now in its 5th year, was being adopted in neighboring towns and even other states. Officers from Paul's precinct traveled to lead workshops and share their experiences, while residents spoke at conferences about how the program had transformed their relationship with law enforcement. Paul became a sought-after speaker, though he was careful never to let the recognition distract from the message. In every speech, he emphasized the importance of humility and the power of listening. "It's not about me," he would say. "It's about the people who trusted me enough to hold me accountable and help me grow. Change doesn't happen alone. It happens together." One day, Paul received an invitation in the mail that left him both honored and nervous. Kayla, now a senior in high school, was giving a speech at a statewide youth leadership summit. She had asked Paul to attend as her guest. The event was a culmination of years of her advocacy work, and it was clear she was stepping fully into her role as a leader. When the day arrived, Paul sat in the audience among hundreds of attendees, his heart swelling with pride as Kayla took the stage. She stood confidently at the podium, her voice strong and clear. "Good morning," she began, her gaze sweeping the crowd. "I'm here today to talk about something deeply personal, about how we as young leaders have the power to shape the future." Kayla paused, letting the room settle. "When I was 10 years old, I had an encounter with a police officer that changed my life. It was one of the scariest moments I've ever experienced. I felt powerless, judged, and afraid for reasons I didn't understand." Paul's stomach tightened as she spoke. The memory of that day still haunted him, but he reminded himself that this moment was about her strength, not his guilt. "But," Kayla continued, her voice steady, "what happened next is what truly defined the story. That officer, Paul Reynolds, made a choice to change. He chose to confront his biases, to listen, and to learn. And through programs like Bridging the Gap, he became an advocate for justice and understanding." The audience murmured in approval, but Kayla held up a hand to quiet them. "This isn't just about him," she said. "It's about all of us. It's about recognizing our own prejudices, no matter how small, and challenging ourselves to do better. It's about creating systems that support accountability and foster empathy." Kayla's eyes scanned the crowd, landing briefly on Paul. "If someone like Officer Reynolds can change, then so can we. And when we change ourselves, we change the world." The room erupted into applause, and Paul felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes. He had never imagined that the young girl he once wronged could become such an inspiration, not just to him, but to everyone who heard her story. After the event, Kayla found Paul in the crowd. She smiled brightly as she approached him, her confidence radiant. "Thank you for coming," she said. Paul smiled back, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for inviting me. You were incredible up there." Kayla shrugged, her smile turning playful. "I learned from the best." Paul chuckled, shaking his head. "I think you've surpassed your teacher." As they stood together, Paul felt a sense of closure he hadn't realized he needed. The journey that had begun with a terrible mistake had brought them both to a place of understanding and hope. "I'm proud of you, Kayla," Paul said, his voice steady. "And I'll keep doing my part to make sure your message reaches as many people as possible." Kayla nodded. "I know you will, and I'm proud of you too, Officer Reynolds." In the years that followed, Paul retired from the police force but remained deeply involved in the Bridging the Gap program. He dedicated his time to mentoring officers and speaking about his journey at schools, conferences, and training academies. Kayla went on to study social justice and public policy in college, using her platform to advocate for systemic change. Her relationship with Paul remained strong, a symbol of what was possible when people chose compassion and accountability over division. Their story became a reminder that even the deepest divides could be bridged, one step at a time. And in their city, where the streets once seemed filled with mistrust, a new legacy was being written, one of hope, understanding, and a commitment to seeing the humanity in everyone. Years passed, and the city continued to evolve. The reforms inspired by the Bridging the Gap program gained traction not only locally but nationwide, reshaping the way law enforcement interacted with the communities they served. Kayla's and Paul's stories became a cornerstone of these reforms, often cited as a testament to the power of accountability and empathy. Kayla, now in her mid-20s, had become a prominent advocate for systemic change. She worked tirelessly with grassroots organizations and national coalitions, bridging the gap between policymakers and the communities most affected by their decisions. Her speeches continued to captivate audiences, and her efforts brought tangible results, from policy changes to increased funding for community-based initiatives. Paul, retired but still active in the movement, became a sought-after consultant for police departments looking to implement similar reforms. His seminars emphasized humility, listening, and the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. Despite his reservations about public speaking, Paul found a surprising sense of fulfillment in sharing his story and helping others learn from his mistakes. One crisp autumn morning, Paul found himself driving to a nearby college campus where Kayla had invited him to guest lecture in one of her public policy courses. As he pulled into the parking lot, he marveled at how far she had come. Walking into the lecture hall, Paul was greeted by Kayla's warm smile. "You ready for this?" she teased, her confidence infectious. "Not really," Paul admitted with a sheepish grin. "But for you, I'll give it my best shot." As the students filed in, Kayla introduced him with the poise of a seasoned speaker. "Today, we're joined by someone whose journey has taught me, and many others, what real growth and accountability look like. Please welcome Paul Reynolds." The students applauded politely, their curiosity evident as Paul stepped up to the podium. He cleared his throat, adjusting the microphone. "Good morning," he began, his voice steady despite his nerves. "I want to start by saying that I'm not here as an expert. I'm here as someone who made mistakes, big mistakes, and had to learn the hard way what it means to truly serve a community." Paul shared his story with honesty, describing the biases he had carried and the harm they had caused. He spoke about his encounter with Kayla, the subsequent fallout, and the steps he had taken to change. "I'm not proud of the person I was," he admitted. "But I'm proud of the work I've done to become better, and if there's one thing I've learned, it's that change isn't about perfection. It's about persistence." The students listened intently, their expressions shifting between curiosity and admiration. When Paul finished, Kayla opened the floor for questions. Hands shot up across the room. One student asked, "What was the hardest part of your journey?" Paul thought for a moment before answering. "The hardest part was facing myself, admitting that I was wrong, that I had hurt people and that my actions didn't align with the values I thought I stood for. But once I got past that, the work became easier because it had purpose." Another student asked, "How can we ensure programs like Bridging the Gap succeed in other communities?" Kayla jumped in to answer. "It starts with listening to the people most affected by the issues. Programs like these work because they're built on trust and collaboration. It's not about law enforcement telling communities what they need. It's about working together to find solutions." The discussion continued for nearly an hour, with Paul and Kayla fielding questions and sharing insights. By the end, the students were buzzing with ideas, inspired to take what they had learned and apply it to their own advocacy efforts. After the lecture, Paul and Kayla grabbed coffee at a campus cafe. They sat by a large window watching students bustle across the quad. "You were great today," Kayla said, stirring sugar into her coffee. "The students really connected with your story." Paul chuckled, shaking his head. "I still can't believe people want to hear it. I was the villain in this story." Kayla reached across the table, placing a hand on his. "You were," she said with a teasing smile. "But you're not anymore. People need to see that change is possible, even for those who start on the wrong side of things." Paul nodded, her words sinking in. "I guess I owe you for showing me that," he said, his voice filled with gratitude. "You don't owe me anything," Kayla replied. "You did the work, Paul. I just gave you a little push." Over the years, their friendship remained a constant source of inspiration for both of them. Kayla continued to climb the ranks of activism and policy work, while Paul became a trusted advisor for reform initiatives across the country. Together, they proved that even the most fractured relationships could be mended with empathy, accountability, and a shared commitment to growth. And as they worked side by side to build a more just and equitable world, they never lost sight of the lesson that had brought them together. Change starts with understanding, and it always starts within. The years brought new challenges and triumphs for both Paul and Kayla. As Kayla's influence grew, she became a prominent voice for systemic reform, her story of grace and resilience resonating far beyond their city. Paul's dedication to promoting accountability and transparency within law enforcement gained him recognition as a trailblazer in community policing. One afternoon, Paul received a call from Kayla. Her voice was vibrant with excitement. "Paul, guess what?" she said, barely able to contain her enthusiasm. "I'm guessing it's good news," Paul replied, smiling at her energy. "I've been invited to testify before Congress," Kayla said. "They're holding a hearing on national policing reforms, and they want me to share my experiences with bridging the gap and community-driven initiatives." Paul felt a swell of pride. "That's incredible, Kayla. You're going to change the game." "You've been such a big part of this," Kayla said sincerely. "I want you to be there with me." Paul hesitated. The idea of stepping into such a high-profile arena made him uneasy, but he knew how important this moment was for Kayla, and for the cause they had worked so hard to champion. "I wouldn't miss it," he said finally. A month later, Paul found himself sitting in a packed congressional chamber, flanked by Kayla and a panel of experts and advocates. The hearing room buzzed with anticipation as lawmakers and media representatives prepared for the session to begin. When it was her turn to speak, Kayla approached the microphone with the same quiet confidence that Paul had admired for years. "Good afternoon," she began, addressing the assembled representatives. "My name is Kayla Johnson, and I'm here today as both a survivor of injustice and a witness to the power of accountability and empathy." She shared her story with clarity and emotion, recounting the day she was wrongfully detained and the transformative journey that followed. Her words painted a vivid picture of the harm caused by systemic biases and the potential for healing when those biases are confronted head-on. "The program that changed my life," Kayla concluded, "didn't just teach officers about the communities they serve. It brought those communities into the conversation. It created a space for understanding, for listening, and for change. That's what we need more of, not just in policing, but in every corner of our society." The chamber erupted into applause, and Paul felt his chest swell with pride. When a congressman directed a question to the panel about the feasibility of implementing such programs nationwide, Kayla turned to Paul. "This is Paul Reynolds," she said, introducing him to the assembly. "A former officer who helped design and implement these programs after his own transformative experience. I believe he can speak to this better than anyone." Paul felt every eye in the room shift to him. Taking a deep breath, he leaned forward to the microphone. "Thank you," he began, his voice steady despite his nerves. "When I first became a police officer, I thought my job was to enforce the law. But I've since learned that true policing is about building trust, serving communities, and protecting the humanity of every individual." Paul spoke about the lessons he had learned, the mistakes he had made, and the efforts that had gone into turning his precinct into a model for reform. He highlighted the importance of accountability, ongoing education, and fostering open dialogues between officers and the communities they served. "Programs like Bridging the Gap work because they force us to confront uncomfortable truths about ourselves and the systems we operate within," Paul said. "Change isn't easy, but it's necessary, and it's possible." By the time he finished, the room was silent, his words hanging in the air like a challenge. Then, one by one, lawmakers began nodding, murmuring their approval. In the weeks following the hearing, Kayla and Paul's testimony sparked renewed momentum for reform efforts nationwide. Their city became a case study for effective community policing, and their story was shared in classrooms, conferences, and news programs across the country. For Paul, the recognition was humbling, but it never distracted him from the work still to be done. He continued mentoring officers, advocating for change, and listening to the voices of those who had been overlooked or marginalized for too long. Kayla's career flourished as she took on leadership roles in national organizations dedicated to justice reform. Despite her growing responsibilities, she remained deeply connected to her roots, frequently returning to her hometown to support local initiatives and mentor young activists. One evening, as the sun set over the city, Kayla and Paul found themselves back at the community center where it had all begun. The room was filled with familiar faces, gathered to celebrate the 10th anniversary of Bridging the Gap. Kayla took the stage, her eyes bright with emotion as she addressed the crowd. 10 years ago, this program started as a response to a moment of pain and injustice, she said. But look at what we've built together. This isn't just a program. It's a movement, a testament to what's possible when we choose understanding over division, growth over stagnation, and hope over fear. She turned to Paul, who was seated in the front row. And none of this would have been possible without people like Paul Reynolds, someone who had the courage to confront his mistakes and turn them into opportunities for change. Paul felt his cheeks flush as the audience erupted into applause. When Kayla stepped off the stage, she joined him at his table, her expression soft but proud. "You've come a long way," she said quietly. "So have you," Paul replied. They sat together as the celebration continued around them, a living testament to the power of second chances and the enduring strength of human connection. As the night wore on, Paul looked out at the crowd, at the laughter and unity that filled the room, and felt a deep sense of peace. The journey had been long and challenging, but it had brought him here, to a place of purpose, belonging, and hope. And as he sat beside Kayla, the girl who had taught him the true meaning of justice, he knew that their story was far from over. It was only the beginning of a legacy that would continue to inspire for generations to come. As the years turned into decades, the legacy of Bridging the Gap became deeply ingrained in the fabric of the city. What began as a response to a moment of injustice grew into a movement that reshaped the community and inspired others nationwide. Kayla's and Paul's journeys remained central to the story, showing that change, while difficult, was possible when individuals and communities committed to it together. Kayla's work took her to incredible heights. She founded her own organization focused on justice reform and youth empowerment, aptly named Voices for Change. Through her leadership, the organization developed mentorship programs, created training curriculums for law enforcement agencies, and offered scholarships to young leaders passionate about equity and justice. Meanwhile, Paul became a key advisor to police departments across the country. Though retired from active duty, he devoted his time to consulting and training officers, always emphasizing the importance of humility, empathy, and a willingness to listen. His speeches often began with the same admission. "I made mistakes that hurt people, but those mistakes became the foundation for everything I've learned about true service." One particularly memorable moment came when Kayla invited Paul to a youth summit in Washington, D.C. The event was designed to bring young activists, community leaders, and law enforcement together to discuss solutions to systemic issues. As Paul entered the massive conference hall, he marveled at the energy in the room. Hundreds of teenagers and young adults filled the space, their voices buzzing with excitement and determination. Kayla greeted him warmly, her face lighting up with a smile. "I'm glad you could make it," she said, leading him toward the stage. "I wouldn't miss it for the world," Paul replied. The two of them shared the stage, delivering a joint presentation that recounted their shared journey. Kayla spoke passionately about the importance of youth leadership, while Paul shared his perspective on building trust and dismantling biases within institutions. During the Q&A session, a young woman raised her hand and asked, "What's the most important lesson you've learned from each other?" Kayla and Paul exchanged a glance, each silently encouraging the other to answer first. "I'll go," Paul said with a small chuckle. He turned to the audience, his expression thoughtful. "Kayla taught me the power of grace," he said. "Her ability to forgive, to see potential in someone who had hurt her, changed my life. She showed me that it's never too late to learn, to grow, or to make amends." Kayla smiled, then took her turn. "Paul taught me that change is possible," she said. "When I was younger, I didn't think people like him could change. But he proved me wrong, and that taught me to keep pushing for progress even when it seems impossible. The room erupted into applause, the connection between the two of them palpable and inspiring. As the summit concluded, Kayla and Paul found a quiet moment to reflect. They stood together outside the conference hall, the cool evening air brushing against their faces. "Do you ever think about how far we've come?" Kayla asked, gazing up at the stars. "All the time," Paul replied, "but I also think about how much more there is to do." Kayla nodded. "That's the thing about this work. It never really ends." "And that's why we keep going," Paul said with a small smile. They stood in comfortable silence, united by their shared commitment to a better future. Years later, as Kayla's organization continued to grow, she reached out to Paul with a bold idea: creating a national training institute dedicated to teaching community-centered policing practices. The institute would serve as a hub for officers, activists, and policymakers to collaborate, learn, and innovate. Paul hesitated at first, unsure if he was the right person to help lead such an ambitious initiative. But Kayla's confidence in him never wavered. "You're the perfect person for this," she insisted. "Your story is proof of what's possible when people are willing to change." With her encouragement, Paul agreed, and together they worked tirelessly to bring the institute to life. When it officially opened its doors, the Kayla Johnson Institute for Community Justice became a symbol of hope and progress, attracting visitors and participants from across the globe. As Paul entered his later years, he often reflected on the twists and turns of his life. He thought about the man he had been, the mistakes he had made, and the profound lessons he had learned. He thought about Kayla, who had gone from being a frightened child wronged by his actions to a force of nature who had changed the world, and changed him in the process. One evening, as he sat on his porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, Paul received a letter in the mail. It was from Kayla, now a highly regarded leader and advocate on the world stage. "Dear Paul," it read, "I just wanted to thank you again for everything you've done. For me, for our city, and for everyone who has been touched by your story. You've shown the world that change isn't just a possibility. It's a responsibility. And you've proven that even those who stumble can help pave the way for others to walk a better path. You've been like family to me, and I'll always be grateful for the journey we've shared. Here's to continuing the work, together and apart, for as long as it takes. With gratitude, Kayla." Paul folded the letter carefully, a lump in his throat. He placed it on the table beside him, alongside a framed photo of himself and Kayla from the first anniversary of Bridging the Gap. As the stars began to twinkle overhead, Paul smiled to himself, feeling a deep sense of peace. His life had been far from perfect, but it had been meaningful. And in the end, that was all he could have hoped for. The work continued, as it always would, but Paul knew it was in good hands. And for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to rest, knowing that the seeds of understanding, empathy, and justice he had helped plant would continue to grow for generations to come.